Vienna. The very name of the city makes us think of an elegant cosmopolitan city at the heart of Central Europe. Lying in the eastern territories of present-day Austria, Vienna has also had a long and particular relationship with the East, be that Eastern Europe or the Islamic world, known so often in centuries gone by as the Orient. Perhaps no other European city has had such a lasting and formative relationship with the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was for centuries the world's most powerful Islamic empire. This is a film about just that, the city's relationship with the Muslim world. We'll be tracing its ups and downs, its periods of conflict, harmony and stability. It's a history marked both by war and one of migration. We'll be interested in exploring the contradictions that appear to lie at the heart of the city's relationship with the Muslim world. One that's characterised by its embrace of cultural and religious differences, but also, quite often, by subtle and hidden patterns of hostility, rejection and exclusion. I'll be walking around the city, talking to friends, colleagues and strangers, looking at buildings, watching Vienna's life and culture, and trying to find traces of the city's Islamic connections. There's a whirl of different languages to hear on the street, and the Muslim community, together with the Orthodox Jewish community, are visibly part of everyday life. Indeed, whether it's meant to draw in tourists or as a political message, Vienna has a tradition of seeing itself and presenting itself as a city where many cultures meet, and do so in a positive way. But does this reflect the view of people on the street today?
Halten Sie dann Wien für eine multikulturelle Stadt?
Wir sind zum ersten Mal hier, also das, was ich wahrnehme, sind viele Sprachen zu hören.
Viele Sprachen
ja.
zu hören. Und das halten Sie das gut, Multikulturalismus? Ist das eine gute Sache?
Ja.
Wirklich?
Ja.
Ohne Frage, ohne Spannung, ohne Zweifel?
Es ist toll, aneinander zu lernen.
Mhm.
Ja, von daher gut.
Ja.
Es hält lebendig.
Aha. Does Vienna feel like a multicultural city for you?
Yeah, I guess.
Why? Why does it feel that way?
When you walk around, you see people from a lot of different countries, different religions, nationalities.
And for you also?
Yeah, everyone's respected the same way and appreciated too.
And do you think it's a positive thing?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I am. I mean, it makes the city nicer and more welcoming.
Und halten Sie Wien für eine multikulturelle Stadt?
Ja, also Wien bemüht sich da sehr. Ja, ich denke, der Anteil an Migration ist in Wien sehr hoch. Also ich glaube 33 bis 35%.
Ja.
Und Wien ist also so gesehen eine multikulturelle Stadt.
Das ist gut. Ist der Begriff Multikulturalismus für Sie ein guter Begriff?
Ja, also Vielfalt per se halte ich schon für gut. Nur muss man natürlich jetzt auch schauen, dass mit den Werten und mit diesem ganzen dem Thema Integration, dass das jetzt irgendwo schon eine Grenze erreicht.
Ja, verstehe ich.
Some people I met had incredibly negative views, but didn't want to talk to camera. Some seem to think the city's multicultural credentials are a source of strength, though others feel that multiculturalism is in danger of going too far. Some seem to feel that Vienna shouldn't harp on too much about its history of conflict with the Ottoman Turks, but others that it should be proud of that history and be prepared to assert and defend its own European Christian identity today, when confronted with things like mass migration and the threat from violent Islamic extremism. It's obviously not a simple question these days. The point is, though, it was never a simple question. The Ottomans had long had designs on controlling parts of Central Europe for dynastic and economic reasons. Vienna, a walled city, stood in their way, and gaining control over it would have been key to their plans. They laid siege to it in 1529. Then, in July 1683, the Ottoman army arrived again, this time under the command of Kara Mustafa Pasha, and laid siege. The siege lasted for over 2 months. Fatigue and hunger set in, and the city, despite its powerful defences, was on its last legs by August of that year. However, the Turks were ultimately defeated at a battle outside the city in September 1683 by a coalition of forces commanded by the Holy Roman Emperor and King John III of Poland and Lithuania. Traces of these tumultuous times crop up in the least expected places.
Well, here I am in a typically Viennese street cafe, starting the day like many people do in Vienna, with a breakfast of good strong coffee and one of these beauties, a croissant. Now, the word croissant, of course, is a French word which means crescent, and most people in the English-speaking world would associate this with France or Paris. But actually, the croissant has something to do with Vienna, with Viennese history, and in particular with Vienna's relationship with the Ottoman Turks and with Islam. But what? That's the question. Well, I'm going over to the Austrian Academy of Sciences to find out. Well, maybe in a minute. Oh, very good.
I've come to interview my friends and colleagues Dr. Johann Heiss and Dr. Johannes Feichtinger at the Academy to find out more.
Die beiden Belagerungen sind nicht die einzigen Versuche. Es gab auch 1532, also 3 Jahre nach dieser ersten Türkenbelagerung, sogenannten Türkenbelagerung, einen Versuch nach Wien vorzudringen, der in Ungarn, im heutigen Kösek oder Günz, gescheitert ist. Und auf jeden Fall diese Kontaktsituation mit den Osmanen, später war ja ein großer Teil Ungarns osmanisch und das österreichische Gebiet ist fast an das Osmanische Reich gegrenzt, könnte man sagen. Also diese Situation hat sehr gute Möglichkeiten hervorgerufen, der Auseinandersetzung und der propagandistischen Verwendung dieser Auseinandersetzung mit den Türken einerseits und mit dem Islam andererseits. Beide wurden sehr oft und über lange Zeit miteinander eins gesetzt und identifiziert. Also für viele Österreicher war Islam türkisch und Türken islamisch.
What role did Islam play in this struggle, if any?
Der Ursprung des Konflikts war keineswegs diese Auseinandersetzung zwischen Kulturen oder Religionen, wenn man so will, sondern die Auseinandersetzung zwischen zwei Großreichen und zwischen zwei Dynastien.
How does the humble croissant fit into all of this?
Geschichte ist, währenddessen die Aneignung des Halbmonds eine Verspottungsgeschichte ist. Und diese Aneignung entsteht eigentlich im 19. Jahrhundert. Im 19. Jahrhundert wird diese Aneignung auch schriftlich niedergelegt. Stadtchronisten berichten über diese Geschichte. Und die Geschichte lautet, dass unmittelbar nach dem Entsatz von Wien 1683 ein Wiener Bäcker namens Peter Wendler ein Gebäck geformt habe in der Form des türkischen Halbmonds und dieses Gebäck sozusagen zum Verkauf, zum Verzehr und zum Verkauf angeboten habe. In Wirklichkeit wissen wir, dass in Wien bereits ein halbes Jahrtausend davor solche Rundgebäcke produziert und verkauft wurden. Im 19. Jahrhundert allerdings sozusagen war die Zeit reif, um daraus einen Mythos sozusagen zu spinnen. Und dieser Mythos ist eben nicht nur auf Wien allein bewahrt geblieben, sondern er wurde verbreitet, er ist eigentlich um die Welt gegangen.
So whilst the conflict and the sieges were all about power, politics, land and control in the first instance, the fact that the city had withstood the onslaught of a specifically Islamic army and resisted a religious threat to Christian Europe became significant for Vienna's stories about itself. That story has touched everything from architecture to culture to cuisine, and even the humble croissant.
We're about to leave the Academy now and go on a walking tour of the city and see what images of Turkishness we can find as we walk around and what we think they have to say about Islam.
What's quite obvious being here is that Vienna went on remembering these victories. Of course, given the timescales, we're not talking about individuals' living memory of events. We're talking rather about how a community or a city collectively remembers key events through its buildings, its art, its civic monuments, museums and the like. Take this image of a sabre-wielding Ottoman soldier on the cornice piece of a house. This is the spot at which the city's forces defeated an Ottoman attempt to plant underground explosives during the 1529 siege. The idea of the severed head of the enemy is a gory though powerful symbol of military victory for many cultures. Here's a gruesome example from the city's Lenaugasse, with his long beard draped menacingly over the archway. During this period, the beheading of enemies was often associated with a Turkish, indeed an Islamic, practice of war. So this image of the disembodied head of a Turk is not only a statement of power, but also a symbol of cultural defiance. It's saying, not only have we Austrians won, but we can also mock and manipulate your culture, turning it back to face you in your defeat. This is even clearer here at the city's military museum in the suburbs.
One glance at the building and it looks almost oriental in some way. But the significance of the building for our film today is actually inside. In the entrance hall we find statues of heroes from Austrian military history, which again tell us a story about the relationship between the city, the Turks and Islam.
Including Johann von Spork, who had fought and had significant victories against the Turks in Hungary back in 1664. Here, he's depicted standing victorious over the severed head of a Turkish soldier.
Where else can we find representations of vanquished Turks in the city?
Well, it's the magnificent St. Stephen's Cathedral, the Stephansdom, here in the city centre, which contains the most famous monument to the siege, the so-called Türkenbefreiungsdenkmal, the Turkish Memorial, which was completed in 1894. Fashioned out of marble, the original monument featured the Virgin Mary carrying the baby Jesus in her arms, surrounded by golden rays of sun, stood atop a marble arch and columns, within which further statues of Austrian soldiers were depicted. In particular, one cavalryman had his horse trample the body of a fallen Ottoman soldier. The original memorial was damaged in a fire at the end of the Second World War, though fragments of it were reinstalled in the cathedral after 1945 and remain there to this day.
There are also less obvious traces of the conflict with the Turks.
We're stood here outside Karlskirche, St Charles's Church. Fantastic piece of architecture. In many ways, it's very much a Christian church. The steps leading up to the front are flanked by two angelic figures, and the pillars running up either side with a spiral motif populated by scenes and figures from the Old Testament. It's very much a Christian and an Austrian monument, a work of high Baroque architecture. Or is it?
If we look at the church's silhouette, it actually looks something like a mosque. And this was deliberate. Emperor Charles VI commissioned the building of the church at a time when Vienna was removing its fortified walls to allow the city to grow. So to build this kind of church, one that resembles a mosque, at the site of the old city walls, was to replace a physical barrier with a symbolic barrier, one that represented the city's control over Islam and served to warn invaders to come no further and to remind the Christian Viennese that they'd resisted Muslim conquest.
Most remarkable, though, is the fact that these sites and works continued to be made, built and installed, in some cases over 200 years after the end of the last siege. This is especially significant because in 1867, Austria incorporated the Kingdom of Hungary to make the dual monarchy of the great Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, if Austria-Hungary in the later 19th century was beginning to try and make friends with the Turkish Muslims, why did Vienna as a city continue celebrating its past victories over them? It's a puzzling contradiction.
If we think about the many ways in which Islam and Islamic culture might have left its traces here in the city of Vienna, then it's not just a matter of looking at images of Turks' heads or vanquished Ottoman soldiers. Vienna also has a long and respected tradition of academic study and learning on matters of Islam.
Vienna's academic community, its university professors and teachers specialising in the languages and cultures of the Oriental world, have also showed mixed feelings towards Islam across the centuries. Some of the most learned Austrian academics in this field emerged from this place, the so-called Oriental Academy. The academy specialised in training people in Oriental languages and culture, not only for academic purposes, but also so that they could live and work in North Africa and the Middle East. And many did, forging their relationships with Islam as much through experience working as diplomats out in the field as through learning from books. One such man was Josef von Hammer-Purgstall, who spent considerable time working at the Austrian embassy in Istanbul. Hammer-Purgstall knew a great deal about Turkish history, and he wrote a voluminous historical work about it, The History of the Osmanic Empire. Partly in sympathy with Turkish culture, he concluded that the things he didn't like about the Ottomans, their tyrannical and corrupt history of government, they had inherited from Islamic values and practices. Quite different, though, was Alfred von Kremer. A product of the same academy, his book, The History of the Dominant Ideas of Islam, discussed the similarities between Islam, Christianity and Judaism based on their shared heritage and traditions of mutual cultural exchange, whilst remaining keenly sensitive to their differences as faiths. Looking then at these two figures, we see that even the world of learning showed itself to be both repulsed by and attracted to Islam, seeing it as an alien faith that warranted criticism and needed resisting, yet also as a brethren religion to Christianity. As Austria-Hungary realigned itself with the Ottoman Empire, so it became increasingly important for Austrian politicians and diplomats to show that they not only understood, but were also, to a degree, in sympathy with Turkish culture and with Islam. As Austria-Hungary grew, it actually started to inherit domestic Muslim populations of its own. In the 1880s, Bosnia-Herzegovina was absorbed into the empire, and with that, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire inherited the community of the so-called Bosniaken, Bosnian Muslims who owed their faith to an earlier period of Ottoman rule. Well aware of these tensions, the empire dispatched a learned Hungarian diplomat, a man called Benjamin von Karloy, to govern the region in the name of the empire. Karloy came up with a whole raft of policies that were intended to make Muslims feel more part of the empire in Bosnia. Many of these focused on their religious needs. Healthcare in the region was poor, but this wasn't really easily solved by simply training up more Austrian doctors and sending them to the region. Lots of Bosnian Muslim women who were not allowed to be seen by male doctors. Karloy came up with a plan for training female doctors for the first time in Austrian history and sending them to the region to minister to Bosnian Muslim women. In the armed forces, the Bosniaken got their own regiments, their own music, their own uniform, were treated with great respect. They even had imams to accompany them to the front so that they could lead prayers before battle. But why was all of this happening? Why was Karloy so insistent on trying to get the Bosnians to feel part of the empire? Well, he needed them. He needed them to fight. He needed their loyalty. He wanted them to feel part of the empire in order that the empire's southern borders were protected. He didn't want them to feel they needed to rise up in rebellion or break away and join one of the neighbouring Slavic states. So actually his policies were as much about power, control and influence of the Bosnian Muslims as they were any kind of expression of religious tolerance or of a particular respect for Islam. As the 20th century dawned, and the tensions which would give rise to World War I began to grow. So Europe's big empires got pulled into increasingly polarised power blocks. Britain, France and Russia on the one hand had aligned against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire on the other. Propaganda materials from this time use all manner of strategies to try and show a special relationship between these cultures. Picture postcards from across the German-speaking world depict Austria and the Ottomans as part of a new family of nations, as the so-called Central Powers. These images make use of pictures of emperors and sultans happily seated together, of interweaving flags and heraldry, and even images of young boys dressed as soldiers of Turkey, Austria and Germany, in a way that implies some kind of intercultural sympathy. Although the young Turk here is identifiably Turkish, recognisable through his uniform and its insignia, there's little that appears Islamic about him, and even the ethnic differences between the boys are downplayed. The eye-catching blood-red ink lines imply a kind of connection between nations and cultures that reaches maybe deeper than mere politics. But this, of course, was propaganda. What did Austria generally, and Vienna in particular with its population, think about this new alliance, this new relationship with the Muslim world? One way of working this out is to look at popular culture. In particular, a famous work of children's literature thought by historians to give voice to some of the darker feelings underlying polite Viennese middle-class society in the early 20th century. It was written by a man called Franz Ginskay, a former military officer and later an official here at the Military Geographic Institute in Vienna. The book he wrote appeared in 1904 and its title was Haci-Braci's Luftballon, Haci-Braci's magic air balloon. The story centres, for a time, on the eponymous character of the title, Haci-Braci, who is a malevolent, balloon-piloting Turkish magician. Some scholars believe Ginskay was making a pun on the name of Haji Bektash Veli, a 13th century Muslim spiritual leader who lived in Turkey, when he chose the name for his character. Either way, the story tells of how this Haci-Braci abducts a young Austrian boy called Fritz from his home and whisks him away in his balloon to the east.
Drin sitzt, die Pfeife in der Hand, ein Türke aus dem Türkenland. Der böse Haci-Braci heißt und kleine Kinder fängt und beißt
But the evil Haci-Braci falls down a well and drowns, and Fritz prevails in the story.
By killing off Haci-Braci in this way, Ginskay puts the plucky Austrian lad back in charge of the story. His ongoing balloon journey takes him across many lands, though finally to Haci-Braci's house in Türkenland, the land of the Turks. Here, Fritz not only frees the hordes of children that Haci-Braci had abducted, but also breaks the magic spell under which Haci-Braci had held his countrymen enslaved. At the end, there's a celebration attended by both Turks and children of the world, before Fritz returns safely home to the bosom of his Austrian family. Despite its obviously racial stereotyping, the story seems to imply that some kind of reconciliation is possible between the Turks and the Austrians, but only once the wizard and his wicked magic have been banished. Under magic here, of course, we can understand Islam. In an age in which Austrians and Muslim Turks were supposed to be becoming allies, friends, and even brothers of sorts, Ginskay's tale gives voice to reservations about that kind of cultural compatibility. His vision of the future requires, we presume, that Turks give up their faith and become Christians before they truly earn a seat at the European table.
Whilst many bookshops won't stock the book today, I was able to buy this version in Vienna. The 2011 edition, which speaks rather of Orientals than of Turks, still, it seems, continues to sell the story with its underlying mistrust of Islam and Muslims to the public today.
We've been on quite a journey. We've looked at everything from scholarship and literature to statues and monuments, and from the city's battlements to its bakeries. We've spoken to academic experts and passers-by in the street, and as we might expect, the story of how this city saw the Islamic world has changed over the centuries. Of course, any city has its darker histories, and any culture goes through periods in which it views outsiders and other cultures with suspicion and hatred. That Vienna at times followed this pattern is not surprising, and makes it no different to and no worse than any other modern city in Europe. It's also of little surprise that the city historically has celebrated resisting successfully an attempt at conquest by armies of another faith. And yet, this is a city which continued to celebrate that victory long after the threat had passed, in all kinds of more and less visible ways. By looking at Vienna, we've seen with a particular clarity how it is possible to think of and present oneself and one's own cultural attitudes as inclusive and multicultural, whilst at the same time harbouring a hidden, or a not so hidden, dislike, mistrust and fear of cultural difference. We live now in an era in which statues of the great men of Western history, set up over the last 2 centuries to commemorate some of the more problematic periods in our shared history, are once again the subject of heated debate. Whether they're the representations of Confederate generals who commemorate the American Civil War on the marketplaces of towns in the US, or statues of the architects of British colonial expansion. We also live in a time at which the tensions between the Muslim and non-Muslim worlds appear, at least in the media, to be more fraught than ever, and in which many Western cultures appear to be responding to those tensions by turning inwards and viewing outsiders with suspicion once again. Whatever we gain from this brief look at Vienna's history and culture, including the great richness that history has to offer, perhaps we should come away with a heightened awareness that even when we think we are at our most progressive, our most tolerant, our most open, we need to remember the difficult histories that have brought us to now, and how these continue to haunt our relationships with our closest neighbours to this day.